Weird things about Joan of Arc that sound completely fake, but are actually history's best documented miracles. You think you know Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, a teenage girl who heard voices, put on armor, led a shattered French army to impossible victory, got burned at the stake, and became a saint. That's the legend. Clean, inspiring, tragic, but the real story. The one buried in the transcripts of her two trials. One that tried to kill her, and one that tried to resurrect her memory 30 years later. That story is unhinged. It's full of contradictions, political absurdities, and details so strange that if you saw them in a Hollywood script, you'd throw your popcorn at the screen and shout, "That would never happen." And yet, it did happen. Every single one of these things is backed by sworn testimony from over 100 witnesses, many of whom knew her personally. The transcripts are intact. The Vatican has them. Historians agree on the basic facts. The weirdness is not interpretation, it's documentation. So, buckle up. We're about to enter a version of the 100 Years' War, where a peasant girl negotiates with popes, declares that her voices speak French better than you, convinces a disgraced king to give her an army, and then gets betrayed by the very people she saved, only to become the most enduring military icon in Western history. And that's just the table of contents. She was a teenage girl who never fought, yet commanded armies. Let's start with the most obvious that's fake fact. Joan of Arc never killed anyone. She never wielded a sword in combat. She carried a banner into battle, not a weapon. She explicitly said she preferred her standard to a lance because she did not want to kill anyone. And yet, she was the de facto military commander of the French army at age 17. In 1429, France was collapsing. The English had captured half the country. The rightful king, Charles VII, was a depressed, indecisive 26-year-old who spent his days in a chateau by the Loire, being mocked as the King of Bourges. The English and their Burgundian allies held Paris, Rouen, and Reims, the city where French kings were traditionally crowned. Charles had no money, no morale, and no credible plan. Enter a 16-year-old illiterate peasant girl from the border village of Domremy. She walked into the royal court at Chinon in February 1429, picked the king out of a crowd of 300 courtiers, despite him wearing a disguise, and told him, "I have come to raise the siege of Orleans and lead you to Reims to be crowned." The court laughed. Then she predicted a French defeat at the Battle of Rouvray, which happened exactly as she said days later. Then she passed a theological examination by the Queen's father-in-law, the Archbishop of Reims, who was shocked by her orthodoxy. Then she was given a suit of armor, a horse, a banner, and a small army. She never had a rank. She never received military training. She simply showed up at war councils, pointed at where the English were weakest, and said, "In God's name we attack tomorrow." And the hardened knights, men like Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, a veteran of 15 years of guerrilla warfare, followed her. Why? Because she was right, over and over again. In the 9 days after she arrived at Orleans, the French recaptured every English fort surrounding the city. During one assault, she was shot in the shoulder with an arrow, and pulled it out herself, then returned to the battlefield. The English, who had been winning for nearly a century, broke and ran. The siege, which had lasted 7 months, was lifted in a single week. None of this should have worked. By all military logic, An illiterate teenage girl with no tactical training should have gotten herself and thousands of soldiers killed. Instead, she revolutionized French tactics. She insisted on direct, aggressive assaults instead of the cautious siege warfare that had failed for decades. She fought alongside the men, taking the same risks, and she inspired such fanatical loyalty that French soldiers who had been deserting in droves suddenly charged English longbowmen head-on. The weird part isn't just that she won, it's that no one can fully explain how. Even today, military historians argue about it. Some say she was a genius of morale. Others say she was simply lucky. But the testimony of the soldiers who fought with her is unanimous. She was not normal. When she spoke, men felt something they had never felt before. Dunois later testified, "It seemed she was sent by God. Her voices were not hallucinations, at least not simple ones." The church that burned Joan of Arc condemned her for heresy, but the main charge they eventually used to kill her was for wearing men's clothes. They didn't condemn her for hearing voices, because even her enemies admitted that those voices produced results that looked an awful lot like divine intervention. Joan said her voices, which she identified as St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, first came to her when she was 13. She described them as a great light and a voice that spoke in a pure French tongue. She said she saw St. Michael as a fair man with wings, and the two female saints as crowned ladies who smelled of perfume. Here's where it gets weird. Modern psychiatry would likely diagnose Joan with some form of epilepsy, or schizophrenia, or temporal lobe epilepsy. She described seeing flashes of light and hearing voices that gave her commands. She also displayed what we might now call grandiose delusions, the belief that she had a divine mission to save France. But then the contradictions appear. First, she had no other symptoms of psychosis. She was lucid, articulate, and capable of complex strategic thinking. During her trial, she outmaneuvered dozens of the most educated theologians in Europe for months. She never rambled, never lost her train of thought, never showed signs of cognitive decline. She was, by every account, exceptionally sharp. Second, her voices gave her information she could not have known. She predicted the exact date of a French defeat before it happened. She recognized the disguised Charles VII in a crowded hall, despite never having seen him before. She told a captain about a sword buried behind the altar of a church in a village she had never visited, and it was there. Third, the voices adapted over time. At first, they just told her to be good and go to church. Then they told her to go to France. Then they told her to cut her hair, wear men's clothes, and lead an army. This progression, from moral instruction to political command to military action, does not fit most models of psychotic disorders, which tend to be more static or degenerative. What did her own contemporaries think? Many believed her. Not just common peasants, but scholars, knights, and bishops. Even the English soldiers who captured her later admitted in private that they feared she might actually be sent by God. The theologian Jean Gerson, one of the most respected minds of the 15th century, wrote a treatise arguing that Joan's voices were genuine, because the fruits of the Spirit are peace, patience, and victory over enemies. The weirdest thing? After her death, the voices stopped. She never appeared to anyone else. No posthumous visions, no follow-up miracles. Just a 17-year-old girl, 3 saints, and the salvation of France. She never learned to read or write, but outsmarted theologians. Joan of Arc was illiterate. She signed her letters with a cross, or a shaky plus Jahan, that she may have learned just for that purpose. She could not read Latin, the language of the Church. She had no formal education. And yet, during her trial for heresy, she faced a panel of nearly 60 judges, doctors of theology, professors from the University of Paris, and legal experts from the English-backed church hierarchy. They spent months trying to trap her in theological contradictions. She evaded them almost every time. The judges asked her, "Do you know if you are in a state of grace?" This was a classic trap. If she said yes, she would be claiming theological certainty that the Church said no human could possess. If she said no, she would be admitting that her voices might come from the devil. Joan's response, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there." The court was stunned. This was the perfect answer. Humble, orthodox, and impossible to attack. The transcript records that the judges were much astonished and moved to the next question. It wasn't a fluke. Over and over, Joan used simple, devastating logic to dismantle complex theological traps. When asked whether her saints spoke French or English, she replied, "They speak French better than you." When asked why she wore men's clothes, she said, "I am among men, and it is more suitable to wear men's clothes." When asked if she would submit to the authority of the Pope, she said she would, but only if the Pope was in Rome and not in English-controlled territory. She also turned the trial on its head multiple times. At one point, she told the judges, "You say that you are my judges. I do not know if you are. But I tell you that you should take great care not to judge me wrongly, because I am sent by God. You are putting yourselves in great danger." That's not the response of a confused illiterate. That's the response of someone who understood power, rhetoric, and human psychology at a level that her educated interrogators could not match. She was burned for wearing pants, but it was actually about something much darker. The official charge on which Joan of Arc was condemned to death was relapse into heresy for wearing men's clothes. She had previously signed a recantation and agreed to wear women's clothes. When she put men's clothes back on a few days later, the Church declared her a hardened heretic and handed her over to the English to be burned. This sounds insane. Burning someone alive for wearing pants, that can't be right. But the legal and theological reality is both stranger and darker. The Church had a doctrinal prohibition in Deuteronomy 22:5. "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak." The penalty in the Old Testament was death. Medieval canon law had softened this, but cross-dressing was still considered an abomination and could be prosecuted as heresy if done for immoral purposes. Here's the key. Joan's refusal to wear women's clothes was not about fashion or comfort. It was about survival. After she signed her recantation, she was returned to English prison, not church prison. Her captors were soldiers, not priests. She was kept in an iron cage and chained to a wooden bed. Multiple witnesses testified that the English guards attempted to rape her. The men's clothes, the hose, the doublet, the tight leggings were a form of armor. They made it physically more difficult to assault her. They also served as a chastity belt of sorts. A woman in men's clothes in a medieval prison was a less obvious target than a woman in a dress. Joan told her judges exactly this. She said she would not wear women's clothes because she was more secure in men's clothes among her guards. She also pointed out that her voices had told her that wearing men's clothes was nothing compared to the greater sin of breaking her vow to God. The Church's response: they told her that if she was truly afraid of being raped, she should ask to be moved to a church prison. But she knew, and they knew, that the English would never allow that. The judges were not stupid. They understood the situation perfectly. They were using her fear of sexual violence as a trap. Either she remained in men's clothes and burned, or she removed them and risked assault. She chose to burn. The execution itself was grotesque. She was tied to a tall pillar in the old market square of Rouen. The fire was built high so that she would burn slowly, not be suffocated by smoke. She asked for a cross. An English soldier made one from a stick and handed it to her. She kissed it and tucked it into her dress. Then she asked a priest to hold a large crucifix in front of her face so she could see it while she died. She called out the name Jesus 6 times as the flames rose. Then she was dead. The English raked back the coals to show that she was truly gone, and then burned her body twice more until only ashes remained. Then they threw her ashes into the Seine River so that no relics could be collected, except they missed something. The executioner later confessed that when the fire was done, he found her heart. It had not burned. He said he saw her heart whole and unconsumed among the ashes. The same king who abandoned her later made her a national symbol, only to abandon her again. Here's a weird political twist that sounds like a parable about ingratitude. Charles VII, the man Joan crowned at Reims, the man who owed his entire throne to her, did nothing to save her when she was captured. She was taken prisoner at Compiègne in May 1430 by Burgundian forces. The French had a chance to rescue her. They didn't. The Burgundians sold her to the English for 10,000 livres, about $2 million in modern money. Charles VII, who had just been handed a kingdom by a teenage girl, sat in his chateau and did not lift a finger. Why? The simplest explanation is that Charles was a political realist. Joan had become a liability. The church was demanding her trial. The English wanted her dead. To intervene would have meant risking war with England, alienating the Burgundians, and possibly undermining the legitimacy of his own coronation, since it was performed by a heretic's hand. Charles chose power over gratitude. But here's where it gets weird. After Joan's death, Charles commissioned a retrial of her case. In 1456, nearly 25 years after she burned, Pope Calixtus III authorized a formal rehabilitation proceeding. The court interviewed 115 witnesses, many of whom had known Joan personally. They overturned her conviction, declared her innocent, and called her a martyr. Charles VII was still king. He had everything to gain from this. If Joan was a heretic, his coronation was tainted. If she was a saint, his throne was divine. So he paid for the entire proceeding, controlled the witness lists, and made sure the verdict was favorable. But even then, he didn't honor her. No statue, no monument, no national holiday. He used her memory for political legitimacy, and then let her fade into obscurity. It took another 400 years, until 1909, for her to be beatified, and 1920 for her to be canonized. By then, Charles VII had been dead for nearly 5 centuries. The rehabilitation trial's transcripts are one of the most complete records of any medieval person's life. We know more about Joan of Arc than we know about almost any other figure from the 15th century, including kings. And what those transcripts show is a girl who was abandoned by everyone who owed her everything to sing, except the common soldiers who loved her and the enemies who feared her. She was a military genius, but her strategy was just attack immediately. Let's talk tactics. Joan of Arc did not study Vegetius's De Re Militari. She did not debate the merits of the feigned retreat. She had one strategy: find the enemy and hit them very hard, very fast. And it worked. Before Joan, French commanders were cautious to the point of paralysis. They had lost so many battles, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, that they believed the English longbow was unbeatable. Their strategy was to avoid open battle, defend fortified towns, and wait for the English to run out of supplies. This strategy had been failing for nearly 100 years. Joan arrived and said, in effect, "Stop being cowards. God is on our side. Charge." At Orléans, she ignored the cautious plan of the French commanders and directly assaulted the English fort of Les Tourelles. She took an arrow to the shoulder and still led the final assault. The fort fell. The English retreated. The siege was broken in 9 days. At Patay, she convinced the French to pursue the retreating English, something they almost never did. The result was a massacre. The English lost 2,500 men. The French lost fewer than 100. It was Agincourt in reverse. At Reims, she pushed the army through enemy territory without supply lines, taking town after town by sheer speed and intimidation. The English could not react fast enough. Charles was crowned in Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429, exactly as Joan had promised. Then she tried to take Paris. It failed. The French assault was repulsed, and Joan was wounded again, this time in the thigh by a crossbow bolt. Charles ordered a retreat. Joan wanted to attack again the next day. He refused. Military historians have debated this ever since. Could Joan have taken Paris? Some say yes. The city was poorly defended, and the citizens were ready to surrender. Others say no. The English reinforcements were arriving, and a failed assault would have been catastrophic. What's undeniable is that after Paris, Joan never won another major battle. She spent the next 8 months in a series of minor skirmishes until her capture at Compiègne. The weird thing about her military career is that it ended not because she lost, but because her king stopped listening to her. When she was in command, she won. When Charles took over, she lost, and then she died. The English spread a rumor that she was a witch and a prostitute. Propaganda is not a modern invention. The English knew that if Joan was just a peasant girl who beat them in battle, their soldiers might lose faith. So they created a counter-narrative. She was a witch, a prostitute, and a heretic. The details they invented are bizarre. They claimed she had slept with countless men. They claimed she had murdered a woman and stolen her identity. They claimed she had made a pact with the devil in a forest called the Fairy Tree, which actually existed near her village. They claimed her banner was a magical object that could curse anyone who looked at it. These accusations were so extreme that even some English commanders doubted them. But they served a purpose. By branding Joan a witch, the English could execute her without admitting they had lost to a teenage girl. If she was a demonic sorceress, then her military victories were not embarrassing. They were supernatural. The propaganda worked. For centuries, English histories portrayed Joan as a fanatic, a madwoman, or a fraud. Shakespeare's Henry VI has her as a promiscuous witch who was ultimately dragged down to hell. Voltaire wrote a mocking poem about her. Only in the 19th century, when France needed a national heroine after the Franco-Prussian War, did the rehabilitation begin. Some of the English propaganda accidentally preserved the truth. Their accusations were so specific: the fairy tree, the sword behind the altar, the exact dates of battles, that they corroborated details from the French testimony. By trying to destroy her reputation, they helped create the most complete historical record of any medieval figure. Her miracle of the sword was probably just good luck. One of the most famous stories about Joan is the miracle of the sword. She told the French captain Robert de Baudricourt that God had commanded her to find a sword buried behind the altar of the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, a village she had never visited. She said the sword would have 5 crosses on it. Baudricourt sent a messenger. The sword was exactly where she said it would be. It was rusty, but after being cleaned, it had 5 crosses on the blade. This sounds like definitive proof of divine intervention. But there's a more mundane and even weirder explanation. The Church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois was a famous pilgrimage site. It was common for soldiers to leave their weapons at the altar as offerings after a battle. The 5 crosses were a common decorative motif on swords of the period. Joan could have heard rumors about a buried sword from local gossip, or she could have been told about it by one of the many soldiers she met before her journey. But here's what makes it weird regardless. Even if it was a coincidence, the sword became a powerful symbol. French soldiers believed it was miraculous. They fought harder because of it. And the English, who heard about the story, became more afraid. The sword's power was not in its origin. It was in the belief it generated. Joan herself never emphasized the sword. In her trial, she said the sword was not important, and that she preferred her banner anyway. When the sword was broken in battle, she didn't seem to care. The miracle was for other people, not for her. She was a feminist icon before feminism existed. Joan of Arc did not think of herself as a feminist. She never argued for women's rights. She never said women should lead armies or preach to crowds. In fact, she explicitly said she would have preferred to stay home and spin wool with her mother. But her life was an implicit challenge to every gender norm of the 15th century. She cut her hair like a man. She wore armor like a man. She led armies like a man, and she justified it all by saying, "I am not doing this by my own will. God commands it." This was genius theology. By claiming divine command, she sidestepped the entire debate about women's roles. You could not argue with her, because she was not making a political statement. She was obeying a higher authority. The same church that forbade women to preach could not condemn her without condemning God. The effect was revolutionary. Thousands of women saw a teenage girl defeat the most powerful army in Europe. They saw her stand trial before dozens of male theologians and hold her own. They saw her die with courage that shamed her accusers. And they remembered. In the centuries after her death, Joan became a symbol for women fighting for equality. Suffragettes carried banners with her image. The French feminist movement claimed her as a precursor. Even today, she is one of the few medieval women who is celebrated for her action, not her piety or her beauty. The weird thing? She would probably have been uncomfortable with all of it. She never wanted to be a symbol. She wanted to be a good Catholic girl who finished her mission and went home. But the mission demanded more, so she became the thing she never intended to be. Her ashes were thrown in the river, but the executioner kept the peace. After Joan burned, the English executioner, a man named Geoffroy Tirage, was ordered to scatter her ashes in the Seine so that no relics could be collected. He did so, but not completely. Years later, the Raj confessed to a friend that when he raked the coals, he found Joan's heart still intact, unconsumed by the fire. He said he was greatly afraid and buried the heart secretly. Then, under pressure from English authorities, he threw something into the river, but not the real ashes. No one knows what happened to the heart. It has never been found. Some believe it was a miracle. Others believe Therage was lying to cover up his own guilt at burning a saint. Still, others think he really did find an organic mass. The heart, being dense and surrounded by fat, might have been slow to burn and panicked. In 1867, a jar was found in a Paris pharmacy labeled "Ashes of Joan of Arc," found at the stake. Scientists tested it in the 2000s and found it contained mummy fragments, plant pollen, and a piece of cloth, but no human remains from the 15th century. The jar was a fake, probably created in the 19th century to capitalize on Joan's popularity. So the true fate of her body is unknown, but the legend persists. Her heart did not burn. She left nothing behind except memory, testimony, and a France that still exists because of her. She was betrayed by a Frenchman, captured by a Frenchman, and sold by a Frenchman. We tend to think of Joan's enemies as English. And yes, the English king Henry VI and his regent, the Duke of Bedford, wanted her dead. But the hands that actually seized her were French. The man who captured Joan at Compiègne was a Burgundian archer named Lionel de Vendôme. Burgundy was a French duchy that had allied with England during the Civil War between the Armagnacs Joan's side and the Burgundians. So, in a very real sense, Joan was captured by a Frenchman fighting for the English. The man who sold her to the English was John of Luxembourg, a Burgundian nobleman who saw a profit of 10,000 livres, more money than he would make in a decade of normal warfare. The man who presided over her trial and condemned her to death was Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a French clergyman who had sided with the English after they conquered his diocese. He was French. He spoke French. He had been educated at the University of Paris, and he spent months trying to prove that a French peasant girl was a heretic. The weird truth is that Joan was killed by a coalition of French and English interests. The English provided the money and the political will. The French provided the legal expertise and the hands-on violence. It was a collaboration, and it worked. After Joan's death, many of her French persecutors had bad ends. Cauchon died suddenly in 1442, reportedly of a malady of the head that some called divine punishment. John of Luxembourg died the same year, leaving his debts unpaid. Lionel de Vendôme disappears from history, remembered only for the crime of capturing a saint. She may have been a cross-dresser for practical reasons, but the Church made it a sin. The men's clothes are the most famous weird thing about Joan. But here's what most people don't know. She started wearing them for practical reasons before her military career even began. When she first left Domremy to travel to the royal court, she cut her hair short and dressed as a male page. Why? Because a group of young women traveling alone in wartime France was a target for bandits, rapists, and enemy soldiers. A group of male soldiers was less vulnerable. Disguising herself as a man was a survival tactic. Later, when she led the army, men's clothes were practical. Armor was designed for men. Riding a horse for hours was easier in hose than in a dress. Fighting was impossible in a skirt. She was not making a statement about gender. She was trying to do her job. But the Church saw it differently. After she was captured, her captors forced her to wear a dress. She complied, briefly. Then she put the men's clothes back on. Her interrogators asked why. She gave 2 reasons. First, because she was afraid of being raped, and second, because her voices had told her it was not a great sin compared to breaking her vow. The church disagreed. They declared her a relapsed heretic for returning to men's clothes after agreeing to stop. And that was the charge that killed her. The weirdest thing, the church later changed its mind. In the rehabilitation trial of 1456, the judges ruled that Joan had been justified in wearing men's clothes because she was in danger of sexual assault and because she was performing a divinely ordained mission. In other words, the same act that got her burned was later declared innocent. So the church burned her for pants, then admitted the pants were fine. She was dead either way. She became a saint for the same actions that got her killed. Here's the final weird twist. Joan of Arc was executed for heresy. The same church that condemned her later declared her a saint. The process took nearly 5 centuries. In 1456, the rehabilitation trial cleared her name. In 1909, she was beatified. In 1920, she was canonized. Today, St. Joan of Arc is one of the most popular saints in the Catholic Church, with hundreds of churches named after her, a feast day on May 30th, and a statue in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The irony is staggering. The charges that got her killed, wearing men's clothes, refusing to submit to church authority, claiming direct revelation from God, are now seen as virtues. The men who killed her are historical villains. The teenage girl they burned is a symbol of faith, courage, and French nationalism. But here's what the canonization didn't change. Joan's own words. She never asked to be a saint. She never wanted to be venerated. In her trial, when asked if she thought she would go to heaven, she said, "I am not sure. But if I go to hell, may God help me. And if I go to heaven, may God keep me there." She was a girl who did what she believed God commanded, suffered the consequences, and refused to compromise even when it meant death by fire. The church killed her for that. Then the church honored her for that. She was right both times. The girl who shouldn't have existed. Joan of Arc is impossible. She should not exist. An illiterate peasant girl who never fought in a battle should not become the greatest military commander of her generation. A teenager who heard voices should not outsmart the most educated theologians in Europe. A heretic burned at the stake should not become a saint. A French patriot betrayed by her king should not save France. And yet she did. All of it. Every weird, contradictory, impossible thing. The transcripts of her trials are still in the National Library of France. You can read them. They are not legends. They are not myths. They are the sworn testimony of more than 100 witnesses, many of whom saw her bleed, heard her speak, and watched her die. They describe a girl who was kind, stubborn, funny, and terrifying. A girl who made knights cry and judges stutter and kings feel small. We don't know what to do with Joan. We never have. She doesn't fit our categories. She wasn't a feminist, a soldier, a mystic, or a heretic. She was all of them and none of them. She was a 17-year-old who saved a country and then burned for it. And that's the weirdest thing of all. We still don't understand her. After 600 years of study, after thousands of books, after 2 trials, a rehabilitation, a beatification, and a canonization, she remains a mystery. We know more about her than almost any medieval person, and we still cannot explain her. Maybe that's the point. Maybe some people are not meant to be explained. Maybe they are meant to be remembered. Joan of Arc died in the flames on May 30th, 1431. She was 19 years old. She had changed the course of European history. And then she was gone. Ashes in a river, heart unburned, voice finally silent. But she left something behind. She left the impossible truth that a teenage girl with nothing but faith can move armies, shame kings, and defy the entire world. That is not a legend. That is a fact. And it is the weirdest thing of all. We left off with her heart not burning, her ashes scattered in the Seine, and a saint who was burned for wearing pants. But the story doesn't end there. Because after her death, things got even stranger. The weirdness didn't stop with the flames. It exploded into politics, forgery, conspiracy theories, and a second trial that overturned the first. And then, 400 years later, she became a bulletproof lesbian icon, a Nazi target, and a feminist meme before memes existed. Buckle up. This is the final ride. The voices might have been caused by a rare disease, but that disease would also explain everything else. In the 1990s, a physician named Dr. John Hughes published a theory that Joan of Arc suffered from a rare form of epilepsy called idiopathic partial epilepsy with auditory features. In plain English, seizures that cause you to hear voices, see flashes of light, and experience intense religious visions. The theory fit the data. Joan described a great light and a voice speaking in pure French. She had sudden commands that she felt compelled to obey. She displayed a lack of fear that could be explained by post-seizure personality changes. But then, the theory hit a wall. Epilepsy of that type usually begins in childhood, but Joan's voices started at 13, the right age, actually. But epilepsy also causes cognitive impairment over time. Joan got sharper. Her memory, logic, and strategic thinking improved under pressure. That's the opposite of what epilepsy does. Then came the genetics. A more recent theory, 2006, suggested she might have had tuberculous meningitis as a child, leaving behind calcified lesions in her brain that triggered temporal lobe epilepsy. This is possible. But again, the lack of cognitive decline is a problem. The weirdest theory of all came from a psychiatrist named Dr. Philip Makoyak, who suggested Joan had cerebral arteriovenous malformation, a tangle of blood vessels in the brain that can cause migraines, hallucinations, and sudden behavioral changes. This condition can also cause a unique symptom, a sensation of hearing a voice that is actually one's own internal monologue, misinterpreted as external. Joan herself said something fascinating at her trial. When asked if she was sure the voices came from God, she replied, "I know it was God. I cannot tell you everything. I am afraid to fail in what I say, but I know it was God." That's not a delusion speaking. That's a person who has exhausted the limits of language. The medical theories are interesting, but none of them explain how a sick peasant girl with brain lesions became a military genius. Maybe the weird truth is that her brain worked differently, and that difference was a gift, not a disorder. She was a target of the Nazis because she was too French and too female. In World War II, the Nazis occupied France, and they understood symbols. One of their first acts was to ban the celebration of Joan of Arc's feast day, May 30th. Why? Because Joan was the ultimate symbol of French resistance against foreign invaders. The Nazis, as foreign invaders, did not want French people gathering to celebrate a teenage girl who kicked out the English. But it went deeper. The Nazi ideology revered strong male warriors and despised women in combat roles. Joan was a direct contradiction. A woman who led armies, wore armor, and defeated professional soldiers. The Vichy regime, which collaborated with the Nazis, tried to rehabilitate Joan as a simple, pious girl who was manipulated by men. In other words, they tried to erase her agency. It didn't work. The French resistance adopted Joan as a secret symbol. Resistance fighters carved her image into coins. They scrawled her name on walls. They called themselves the Children of Joan of Arc. When Paris was liberated in 1944, crowds carried banners with her face. The weirdest part, the Nazis also tried to claim her. Some far-right German occultists, including Heinrich Himmler, attempted to argue that Joan was actually Germanic, that Arc came from a Germanic root, and that she was a Nordic seeress corrupted by the French. This was so absurd that even other Nazis laughed at it. But it shows how powerful her image was. Both sides in a world war wanted her on their side. She's been dead for 600 years, and she still makes fascists angry. Her brothers were made nobles, and then faked her survival for decades. After Joan died, her family did not fade into obscurity. King Charles VII, in a rare moment of guilt, ennobled her entire family in 1429, even before her capture. The name du Lys of the Lily was added to their surname. They became nobles overnight. But here's where it gets weird. Joan's two surviving brothers, Jean and Pierre, spent the next 30 years pretending that she had not actually died. They traveled around Europe introducing a series of young women as the real Joan of Arc who escaped the fire. Why? Money. Each imposter Joan could command donations, gifts, and military support from gullible nobles. The most famous impostor was a woman named Claude des Armoises, who appeared in 1436 claiming to be Joan. She looked similar, knew details of Joan's life, and even fooled some of Joan's old comrades. For 5 years, she lived off the legend. The brothers eventually admitted the truth, or were forced to. But the scam worked. They lived as wealthy nobles for the rest of their lives. Not a single person was punished for fraud. And here's the kicker. No one knows what happened to the real Joan's body. The ashes were scattered. The heart was buried somewhere. For decades, people claimed to have met the real Joan, who was still alive. The Vatican eventually had to issue a statement saying that Joan died at Rouen, and that any living claimants were frauds. But the doubt never fully disappeared. Even today, there are small communities in France who believe that Joan escaped, married a nobleman, and lived quietly in the countryside. There is zero evidence for this, but the weirdness of her life makes people want to believe she cheated death. The rehabilitation trial was a legal farce, but it gave us the truth. The 1456 rehabilitation trial is often celebrated as justice finally done. Pope Calixtus III authorized it. Joan's mother, Isabel Romy, petitioned for it. Over 100 witnesses testified. The verdict was a complete exoneration. Joan was innocent, her trial was corrupt, and she died a martyr. But the trial was also a political operation. Charles VII controlled it. He selected the witnesses. He paid the judges. He had a vested interest in proving that Joan was not a heretic, because his crown depended on her divine mission. The trial was less an act of justice than an act of state. Here's what makes it weird. Even though the trial was rigged in Joan's favor, the testimony it collected is incredibly reliable. The witnesses were cross-examined by different judges. their stories matched. They included people who had no reason to lie, soldiers who fought alongside her, priests who heard her confession, even a few English witnesses who admitted she was no witch. The rehabilitation trial is the reason we know so much about Joan. Without it, we would have only the hostile trial of 1431, which was designed to kill her. The later trial preserved the voices of people who loved her, and because it was a legal proceeding with sworn testimony, historians trust it more than almost any other medieval source. So a political farce gave us the truth. The weirdness of Joan's afterlife includes this paradox. The same king who abandoned her also, decades later, funded the process that made her a saint. She was a cross-dressing icon for the LGBTQ+ community, long before Stonewall. This is a sensitive but important weird fact. Joan of Arc has been claimed by LGBTQ+ communities for over a century. Why? Because she rejected traditional female clothing, lived among men as an equal, and faced death for refusing to wear a dress. In the 1920s, Parisian lesbians held secret balls in her honor. In the 1970s, feminist and lesbian artists created Joan of Arc as a symbol of gender defiance. The scholar Vern Bullough argued that Joan was the most famous cross-dresser in Western history. Modern queer theorists point to her trial testimony, "I do everything by the command of God," as a prototype of living authentically despite social punishment. But here's the caveat. Joan never identified as anything other than a devout Catholic girl who was doing a job. She did not think of herself as queer. She was not making a political statement about gender identity. She was trying to avoid rape and lead an army. The weirdness is not that she was secretly LGBTQ+. The weirdness is that her actions, intended purely for survival and mission, became a symbol for people with completely different identities and struggles. She belongs to everyone who has ever been told that they cannot do something because of how they look or who they love, and that includes a lot of people. The lesbian poet Vita Sackville-West wrote a biography of Joan in 1936 that was quietly groundbreaking. She described Joan's masculine soul and her refusal to be feminine. The book was banned in some Catholic circles, but it sold out in London within days. Joan herself would probably be confused. But she also said, "Of the love or hatred of God, I know nothing." She accepted mystery. Maybe she would accept this mystery too. Her banner was more important to her than her sword, and it might have been magical. We mentioned that Joan carried a banner, not a weapon. But here's the full weirdness. She designed the banner herself. It was white linen, fringed in silk. On it was an image of God holding the world, flanked by two angels, with the words Jesus Maria, Jesus Mary, and a fleur-de-lis. She told her priests that she wanted the banner because it would be less tiring for me than carrying a sword. But she also said something else. "I never killed anyone. I carried my banner. My standard, when it was carried in battle, never got hit. That showed me it was safe." Soldiers testified that when Joan's banner was raised, enemy arrows seemed to miss. Once, during an assault, her standard-bearer was killed. Joan grabbed the banner herself, held it high, and the French broke through a gate that had held for hours. Was it magic? No, but it was a psychological weapon. The English saw that banner and remembered every battle they had lost to her. The French saw it and remembered every victory. A piece of cloth with no inherent power changed the course of war because people believed it did. That's the real weirdness of Joan. She understood something that modern military strategists call information warfare, and medieval people called signs and wonders. She created symbols that worked: the banner, the sword, the armor, the haircut. All of it was theater. But theater that won. She said once, "I am not afraid of anything except betrayal." She understood that symbols can be betrayed too, but she trusted her banner, and for 9 months it never failed her. She might have been a pawn of a secret prophecy called the Maid of Lorraine. One of the weirdest historical footnotes is a prophecy that circulated in France decades before Joan was born. It was attributed to a mystic named Marie Robin, or sometimes to Merlin the Wizard. The prophecy said, "France, lost by a woman, shall be saved by a woman." The first woman was Isabeau of Bavaria, the queen who signed the Treaty of Troyes, giving the French crown to the English. The second woman was allegedly Joan. The prophecy was well known. Charles VII's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, was a powerful political operator who had every reason to find a maid who could rally the troops. Some historians argue that Joan was not a spontaneous miracle, but a carefully selected pawn. Yolande and her agents heard rumors of a visionary girl in Domremy, tested her, found her useful, and pushed her forward. Here's the evidence. Joan's first meeting with Robert de Baudricourt, the local captain, was initially a failure. He laughed at her and sent her home. But then she came back. Something changed. Baudricourt suddenly believed her. What happened in between? The records are silent. But Yolande had agents in that region. The counter-evidence? Joan's own testimony, which never mentions Yolande, and the fact that Yolande later denied any involvement. But powerful people lie. Weird truth. Even if Joan was a pawn, she was a willing one. She believed her voices. She would have gone to war anyway. The prophecy just gave the nobles a reason to listen. In the end, the prophecy came true. France was saved by a woman. Whether that woman was a divine instrument or a political tool is a question we cannot answer, and maybe it doesn't matter. She saved France either way. The fire that didn't burn her heart. We have to end where we began, with the fire. The executioner said her heart did not burn. That is probably a legend. But it is a legend that tells the truth. Joan of Arc's body was destroyed. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine. Nothing physical remains, but her heart, the core of who she was, still beats in the pages of trial transcripts, in the testimony of soldiers and priests, in the desperate courage of a teenage girl who faced the greatest powers of her age and refused to bend. She was weird. She was impossible. She was a heretic who became a saint, a virgin who dressed like a soldier, a peasant who commanded kings, an illiterate who outthought theologians. She was shot, wounded, captured, sold, tried, and burned. And she never once said, "I was wrong." In 1920, when the Catholic Church declared her a saint, the bells rang across France. But the people who knew her, the soldiers who saw her bleed, the priests who heard her confession, the enemies who watched her die, had already declared her a saint 500 years earlier. They did it quietly, in their hearts, without papal approval. That's the final weird thing about Joan of Arc. She was canonized by the Church, but she was sainted by history. And history does not lie. History has the transcripts. History has the witnesses. History has the impossible fact of a girl who should not exist, but does. She said before she died, "I am not alone. I have my voices, and they have never failed me." They never did, and neither has she.